Welcome back to the program. We are joined again by Seyed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at Tehran University and a former advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team, to discuss what is happening now from Lebanon to Gaza and Iran. So, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you very much for inviting me again. It's always a great pleasure.
Well, we see there's a tendency to call peace, or at least when Israel or the United States they go after one target, they tend to freeze other adversaries, and they refer to this as peace. So, for example, we saw that there was quite strong, well, continues to be strong sanctions against Venezuela, but after the Russians invaded Ukraine, then of course the Americans decided that, well, now Venezuela was not so bad after all, and they could improve ties because they needed another source of oil. But we also see this tendency in the Middle East. That is one of the tricks of Israel has always been to go after one adversary at a time and keep the other conflicts stable. And again, also referring to this as a peace. Now, the last time we had a peace agreement between Israel and Lebanon was back in, was it November of 2024? And this was then followed by the attacks on Syria and the toppling of Assad the month thereafter. So now that the Gaza peace deal is in place and, well, as Trump celebrates ending 3,000 years of conflict in the Middle East, we now see conflicts starting against Lebanon. There's been a lot of attacks lately, especially over the past day. I think up to 20 airstrikes on the southern parts of Lebanon. Do you see it in this pattern, or at least do you think a wider war against Lebanon is now in the cards, or is this just gradual, small-scale bombing, or trying to prevent a larger war while doing the small-scale bombing?
You're absolutely correct. And one of the interesting things that the West does, and Western media is obedient to the Western political establishment, and I think people by now have understood that. In the past, people would have many people would have thought differently, but I think over the past few years, especially after the genocide in Gaza, it's becoming increasingly clear to people across the world, and especially in the West itself and in the United States in particular, the role that the media plays, the legacy media, or the media that's influenced by the powerful or owned by the powerful. And what they do is they frame everything in a particular way to legitimize it. So the genocide in Gaza, it's it's Israel-Hamas war. And if you recall, just a day or two ago, Trump said that Hamas lost like 70,000 people. And I think he was alluding to the official death toll of Gaza. So everyone is Hamas. Those infants are Hamas. The women are Hamas. The school children are Hamas. Everything is Hamas. That legitimizes mass murder. And the fact aside that probably hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in Gaza due to the fact that many of them are still under the rubble. We don't know the true numbers. The fact that many people just die of, let's say, cancer, there's no medicine, or they get infections and they die. And later on, the death toll will come out because the trajectory for a population of an area will be deeply affected, and we'll know, how many people were lost as a result, more or less. But the fact is that they frame it in a certain way. And this is exactly what they did in Syria. Assad forces, whoever died, it was the fault of Assad. It was the Assad. The fact that he was fighting ISIS and Al Qaeda and Jaish al-Islam and all these terrorist Takfiri groups that are under that were being paid for by the United States and its regional proxies, whether it's Qatar or Erdogan or whoever, and doing the bidding of the Israeli regime. That doesn't matter. It's all Assad. In Lebanon, they do the same thing. They say Hezbollah strongholds. When the war against Hezbollah began last year, when there was a really heavy fighting, I was in Beirut, And I arrived the day before Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred. And because I thought there was going to be war, I thought if I was there, I could help with media and that sort of thing. I didn't think it would play out as it did. But when the war began, the Western media, and including the journalists in Beirut, were calling this, every time a place would be hit, they'd say, this is a Hezbollah stronghold. But these were all apartment buildings in southern Beirut where in each of them 10, 20 families had been living. They're just ordinary apartment blocks. And these Western journalists knew this because they had Lebanese fixers, they had Lebanese drivers, they had Lebanese producers. Some of them were Lebanese or half Lebanese, but they had to abide by that narrative. And I would call them out on this. They knew they were not telling the truth. But by framing them as Hezbollah targets, or this is a Hezbollah stronghold, they legitimize the slaughter of ordinary people and the destruction of private property. Now, what the Israelis have been doing since the ceasefire, and you're absolutely correct, in Gaza we've had a ceasefire, but since then, until yesterday, 10 people were murdered. But it's not considered apparently in the West as a severe violation. Every single person who's killed has a family. They have relatives. They have possibly children, a wife, a husband, parents, people who depend on them, people who love them. But they're not important. So if 10 people in Gaza die, the ceasefire is holding. So when I was in Beirut, and the Israeli regime was bombing southern Beirut, they're bombing cities across the central and southern Lebanon and in the north as well, and murdering families. The Western media, the Western journalists based in Beirut, who all knew what was happening, and that these were apartment blocks full of innocent families. They had drivers, they had people who worked with them, fixers, producers who were Lebanese, but they were calling them Hezbollah strongholds in order to legitimize the bombing of cities. And this is basically what happened again last night. The Israelis frame it as Hezbollah, as they've been doing it for months, because for months they've been bombing Lebanon literally every day and killing people. But it's not even reported in the Western media. Almost 300 people have been murdered since the ceasefire with Lebanon. And the interesting thing is that the Israelis requested the ceasefire and Western governments are the guarantors. But they've been killing Lebanese citizens every day. Even yesterday, there were multiple attacks. They would drop grenades or stun grenades on farmers in the south. They killed a person somewhere else. Then they bombed these factories that were owned by the private sector that were rebuilding. What the Israelis are doing is that they're murdering people and they're trying to prevent ordinary people from rebuilding their homes in the south. They are trying to ethnically cleanse southern Lebanon. This is the objective. And the West knows this. Western journalists based in Beirut know this. They cannot pretend that they don't have access like in Gaza. You have tens of Western embassies in Beirut. You have all the major news agencies based in Beirut with local employees. They know what's going on. But they don't discuss it in this context because that's just how it is. It's, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Remember, in Syria, when Jolani, who just recently went to the United States, when he got there, he was welcomed. This is the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria. He goes to the to New York in the same month that 9/11 was carried out a couple of decades ago. And then he has a meeting with Petraeus, as people have seen, which was very bizarre, where Petraeus says, I'm one of your biggest fans. And he says, he's worried about his sleep and how if he's taking good care of himself. This is the upside down world that we're living in today, whether it's in Gaza or in Lebanon or where, when it comes to Iran, the Israeli regime carried out a blitzkrieg unprovoked attack and the West supported it. They said Israel has the right to defend itself. So whatever the Israeli regime does, the West will frame it in a way to legitimize it, even if it's a Holocaust. And so right now what's happening in Lebanon is that last night they bombed factories that are used and facilities that are used to rebuild people's homes. But they will call it Hezbollah. Just as in Gaza, they'll call it Hamas. In wherever they strike, they'll try to frame it in a way so that ordinary naive people in the West and beyond see it through that framework.
It does remind me a bit when, well, after Giuliani and his henchmen had taken power in Syria, they were driving across the countryside and well, executing a lot of civilians. They make the videos of executing them. They upload these videos on the internet, and then, of course, I remember the statement coming from the EU where they condemned the Assadist loyalists, who, even though Assad was gone, who, so they blamed the civilians being murdered, executed by an ISIS leader who still had a bounty on his head then. It's quite extraordinary, but as you said, framing is quite important. I want to ask you about some of the targets though, because was a few days ago the Israelis they bombed some bulldozers in Lebanon. There was reports on how there were just melted metals almost left, and last night they attacked one of the targets which the Israel bombed were a concrete factory. I mean, these are hardly military targets. So how do you make sense of this?
This is all about preventing the rebuilding of southern Lebanon. The Israeli regime wants to stop people from going home. They'll kill them, they'll destroy their homes, and then they'll destroy any facilities that are used to rebuild those homes, to rebuild the schools, to rebuild the infrastructure and the roads. That's what they're doing. Everyone knows this. And Lebanon is not a huge country. It's very easy for Western journalists to figure this out. And after all, this is a ceasefire anyway. Whoever is in the south, whatever they're doing, the Israelis have no legitimate right to strike them on a daily basis. In Palestine, in northern Israel or in northern occupied Palestine, Israeli soldiers and people go back and forth, but no one strikes them because it's a ceasefire. There's supposed to be no firing, but every day the Israelis are doing this, just like what we've seen in Gaza over the last 3 days. In the West, the Israeli regime can do whatever they want. They can kill people. They can destroy infrastructure. They can destroy schools. They can terrorize. Actually, one of the airstrikes last night was very close to a wedding. A huge airstrike. They don't care. And Western media doesn't care. And Western governments don't care. So what is going on in Lebanon right now is that the Israeli regime wants to empty southern Lebanon. Because at the end of the day, this is all about Greater Israel. Whether it is the West Bank, whether it's southern Syria, whether it's southern Lebanon, or whether it's Gaza, this is all about the new phase in establishing Greater Israel.
So there have been some reports that Netanyahu informed Putin or gave a message to Putin, which he should convey to the Iranians, that Israel no longer wants to have a war with Iran. So in other words, it's time for peace. Now, usually that means another target has been picked. I was wondering if you see it in this context. Is this to lower the guard of Iran in a possible attack, or do you see this possibly linked to what is happening in Lebanon? Because if you want to clean out southern Lebanon, then it's an ideal time to send a message of peace to the Iranians.
Yes, that's quite possible that right now what he wants to do is invade Lebanon and start slaughtering the Lebanese, and that he does not want a war with Iran. Of course, I think that the Iranians are not going to just sit and let them and let the Israeli regime slaughter Lebanese citizens and get away with it. But that is one possibility. Another possibility is that he wants the Iranians to let their guard down. But also, a third could be that President Putin may have said something, and then he said something to President Putin in response, and President Putin, made this public. And I think that was to put pressure. That could be another way of reading it, that the Russians want to put pressure on the Israeli regime, because once this goes public, if the Israeli regime attacks Iran, then it will harm Russian-Israeli relations. Uh, so it could be either. It could be any of these. It could be a prioritization of southern Lebanon and another genocidal assault there, and the West will frame it like they do Gaza, Hezbollah strongholds. These are Hezbollah targets when they slaughter children. It'll all be Hezbollah, just like in Gaza. If they strike Iran and they murdered one scientist, a nuclear scientist who worked for the civilian program, a completely civilian program under International Atomic Energy Agency, uh, within it was all monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They murdered 70 people in an apartment block to kill him. That's how the Israeli regime works. But the Western media calls this an intelligence coup by bringing down an apartment block, murdering 70 people, lots of 25 kids, and that's how they frame it. So whether he's going to prioritize slaughtering families in Lebanon, and that's why he doesn't want war, or whether whether he was telling this to President Putin because he was under his pressure from President Putin, or he's trying to deceive Iranians, or whether he just said this, but President Putin made it public to put pressure on the Israeli regime. I don't know, or it could be a combination of all of these things. But anyone who believes a word that Netanyahu says is an utter fool. And Hezbollah and the resistance in Lebanon, they're preparing themselves. Iran is preparing itself. And nothing is going to stop them from being prepared for the worst, because everyone knows that the West will allow the Israeli regime to do whatever it wants. If the regime restarts the genocide in Gaza, there will be no sanctions. The aid will continue to flow in from Europe and the United States, and Western media will try as much as possible to look away. And of course, now that the means for information are all being bought off by Zionists, it's going to be more quiet in the public sphere and less information out there. Nothing will change. So everyone knows that they have to prepare themselves. And I'm sure Hamas and this Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they're preparing themselves. No doubt that Hezbollah is doing so. No doubt that Ansarullah and the Yemeni armed forces are preparing themselves. And there's no doubt that Iran and the resistance in Iraq is doing the same, because they know that the Israeli regime is completely dishonest, genocidal, and that they have the full backing of the West, no matter what sort of atrocities they carry out.
We see now, well, in this context, I was wondering, how do you see or interpret the United States sending all these new military assets into the region? I initially assumed this was intended for a second war with Iran, which is, well, I guess still a possibility, but do we know anything else about this?
It's difficult to say, but I think that one thing that people should recognize is that Iran, of course, for those who are following the situation, the Iranians defeated the Israelis in the war, even though the Israelis carried out a blitzkrieg attack and they had the full support of the West, and regional countries assisted the Israeli regime, whether it was the Republic of Azerbaijan or the northern part of Iraq or these dictatorships in the Persian Gulf or Turkey through its military base and its ally Aliyev in Azerbaijan is Erdogan's ally. So despite this network of support for the Israeli regime across the region and in the West, Israelis lost the war against Iran. But Iran's real power does not lie in its capabilities to fight the Israeli regime. The ability to fight the Israeli regime is important, and next, if the Israelis attack again, Iran will strike harder. They're preparing for another war. But Iran's focus has always been on the United States. That, I think, is something people should take into consideration. For the past 30 years, the Iranians have been preparing themselves for war with the United States because they've always felt that there's a possibility that the United States will invade the country, especially since 9/11, especially since Iraq and Afghanistan. They took Afghanistan, then they took Iraq, and then there were plans to invade Iran. So for the last 2 decades in particular, the Iranians have been working full time to prepare themselves for a possible attack by the United States. So Iran's real assets, military assets, underground bases with not necessarily these long-range missiles exclusively, but mostly short-range, medium-range missiles, hundreds of thousands of drones. They are based near the Persian Gulf region, the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Oman, and alongside the Iraqi border for a possible U.S. attack. So what Iran has shown to the world in the 12-day war against the Israeli regime, even though it was not prepared for that war, it was attacked unprepared. It didn't expect an all-out war by the regime with such extensive regional and Western support. That power was impressive, but if there is war with the Americans, what the Iranians can do to the Persian Gulf is infinitely worse for the Americans and the West and its adversaries. And all these family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, they host American bases. So it's not just about American bases. The hosts would be complicit. You cannot have an American base in your country and then have America wage a war against you, and then those countries say, well, we're neutral. That doesn't work. And we saw how Yemen and Ansarullah, they shut down the Red Sea with much smaller capabilities. The Iranians can easily shut down the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Oman with ease. They don't have to close the Strait of Hormuz. Their capabilities are very massive. They can destroy everything. So it would be very foolish for the Americans to get involved in a war with Iran. It was not something that Iran wants. Iran is protecting the global economy by actually showing such strategic patience. Iran wants the global economy to function normally, but if the Americans go for war and these family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region host their bases, they're all a part of the war. If they prevent Iran from exporting their oil, then Iran won't allow their allies to export Iran their own oil either, U.S. allies. So whenever someone thinks about what Iran can do to the Israeli regime, and that's a lot, if the Iranians go out for all-out war with the Israeli regime, they can destroy their cities easily. But what Iran has prepared for the United States in case of U.S. aggression is far, far greater and far more. And Iran would have a much greater advantage because drones and small missiles you can move them around much more easily. The Iranian armed forces would be much more flexible and capable in any war with the United States because these major missiles are more difficult to move out, to set up, to launch. But smaller missiles and drones, very easy. They can just, anyone who looks at the map, the Persian Gulf is not a big place. And again, if all you have to do is go back to the US war on Yemen in the Red Sea and see how that ended. So Iran's capabilities, which are, infinitely greater than what we saw in Yemen, they would bring down the global economy. So hopefully the Americans are sane enough to recognize that.
Yeah, my last question is more about what you already referred to some extent. That is the possibility of the conflict in Gaza restarting. Because again, as we're all told to celebrate the Gaza peace deal, and as I mentioned, Trump putting an end to conflict in the Middle East, I can't help but to have some limitations on my optimism, as none of the underlying causes of the conflict seems to have been addressed. Indeed, in the day after the peace agreement, Trump made a statement that if Hamas doesn't disarm, he will disarm them quickly and violently. I mean, this is not usually the language you have the day after a peace agreement, but it seems that it's somewhat reflected in the lack of a clear pathway where we're going from this. Because if this is just peace through subordination by one side asserting its dominance, or as peace through strength, as we say here in NATO countries, as opposed to resolving the underlying causes and finding a way of peaceful coexistence, it doesn't seem like this conflict will go away anytime soon. But again, it's very unclear, I guess, exactly what is expected from each side going forward. How stable do you see this peace deal, and I guess what should we expect in terms of mutual commitments?
I agree completely. This is not a peace deal. This was an attempt by the United States to force the Palestinians into capitulation. But also, it does show how weak the Israeli regime is, because if the Israeli regime could finish the job, as they say, then the Americans would not have put forward this so-called peace deal. And that just shows that the world is changing. The United States and the European elites, they recognize that people across the world despise them and their policies, including in the West, and that people have turned against this apartheid regime, this genocidal regime, despite Western media attempts to distract people attention away from reality, to uh, frame the narrative as if this was a war against Hamas, instead of a genocide, just like in Lebanon or Syria or elsewhere. They frame it in a way to legitimize mass murder and slaughter. Despite all that, people have woken up to the reality. So I think that this so-called this fake peace deal was a reflection of that global awakening. Now, these regional leaders, they betrayed the Palestinian cause by uh, praising Trump for the deal, whether it's Qatar or Erdogan or any of these other, or Sisi, that this was a betrayal. There's no doubt about that. And then the monkey show that we saw in Cairo was a further betrayal, because they all went there basically to whitewash the genocide and to whitewash Trump's role in the genocide, uh, so that they can stay in his good books. And they were all humiliated. We've all seen clips of that event, and it was just embarrassing to watch. Just like for me, watching General Petraeus tell Jolani that I'm one of your biggest fans, it was really embarrassing to watch for me. And some of these clips were very embarrassing. Even the British Prime Minister, and let alone the traditional proxies who were humiliated in front of the global audience. But that was just for Trump. It had nothing to do with the Palestinians. I think the truth was shown when he spoke to the Knesset, that he had no regard for the Palestinian people, and that the United States is Israel first, Zionist first. Adelson's role, and because of them, they go into the White House whenever they want. They get the Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan Heights, because of money, because of Zionism. I think we all know what the situation is. Anyone who watched the events in in Palestine, in the Knesset, or in Egypt, I think it's made it's if someone has open eyes, they know the reality of what's going on, and that's exactly why Iran refused to participate, because this was an attempt to whitewash the genocide, to whitewash the U.S. role in the genocide, and an attempt to humiliate all those countries who, for whatever reason, want to remain in Trump's good books. But this is not over, and this plan of Trump is not going to be implemented because the Palestinians will not disarm. They know if they disarm what will happen. The same thing that happened in southern Lebanon last night will happen in Gaza. The same thing that we've seen over the last 3-4 days in Gaza, where Palestinians have been murdered, and the West says nothing about it, that will continue permanently, and it will expand if the Israelis see that they have nothing to stop them. They will not allow Gaza to be normal. They never did in the past, and they won't in the future. So the Palestinians have no option but to remain vigilant. And the Israeli regime will continue to try to create the greater Israel. And the West, as long as the current political establishment is in power, will continue to do what the Israeli regime wants them to do. So I think your reasons for skepticism and are quite valid. I'm very glad that the ceasefire did happen. The Iranians also support it. The axis of resistance members like Hezbollah and Ansarullah in Yemen and the others, they all support it because the Palestinian people, the children deserve to have infant formula. Their children deserve to have food. Their women deserve to be able to sleep at nights without fearing a bomb being dropped on their tent. I think that's the least one could have in this dystopian world that the West has created. So they support the ceasefire so that these children can grow up and their stinted growth can be compensated for in some limited way or form, and so that all those traumatized and those tens of thousands of people who've been injured and maimed for life, that they could get some help. That is a good thing. But would Netanyahu and the likes of Netanyahu and his allies and the supporters of the Israeli regime discontinue genocide and invasion and aggression? No, that's not going to happen. And that's why, but then the world has changed. You have the rise of BRICS, you have the rise of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you have the decline of Western economies, which the Israelis are completely dependent upon. Israel is a puny, weak regime. It is fully dependent on foreign aid. It's all about Western support. The West is declining, the war in Ukraine, neoliberalism, all these issues, the divisions inside Western societies, inside the United States. The United States, it's confrontation with literally the entire world, the trade war with China, the war in Ukraine, Iran, but also Brazil, India. The West is on the decline, on the relative decline, and that decline makes the Israeli regime also relatively weaker. So the regime is despised across the world and in the West, in the eyes of ordinary people on the streets in Western countries. Its backers are becoming increasingly unpopular. Its backers are becoming weaker. The regime itself is battered because, economic crises, social crises, and of course the crisis of delegitimization in the eyes of the international community. It's not as if the Israeli regime is in a good situation at all. It's in a very bad situation, and it's getting worse. Meanwhile, the global majority, which is not the West, the global South or the global majority, it's consolidating. It's growing more closer. It's gradually in there. These countries are integrating increasingly. BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others, which includes Iran. Iran is a key member. So I don't see this in the long run as to the advantage of the Israeli regime and Zionism. And I think that in the long run, despite the dark days that we are seeing in today's world, in the long run, Zionism cannot last.
As someone who, yeah, resides here in the West, I always been convinced that the West, as the world distribution of power shifts to multipolarity, that we have an opportunity though to carve out a stable, both prosperous and secure role in the world as one of the many powers. Then I'm thinking about Europe. The problem, I think, for us is the reluctance to give up on the unipolar moment, the continued ambitions to restore, yeah, global dominance. I think this is very self-destructive because we're undermining this ability to have a to function as one pole in the system, in exist in peace with the others. As you said, it feels like we're running into conflict with everyone these days. I mean, when you look around the world and from China, Russia, Iran, now India, I mean, every corner of the world is seen as being problematic. At some point, we should think if it's our position in the international system, which it no longer reflects reality. But yeah, just a comment on the on what happened in Egypt, though, because I found it a bit absurd as well. I mean, I'm very happy as well to see the ceasefire in Gaza, and yeah, some of the humanitarian situation improving, the bombing ending. But it's also a bit like the mixed feelings I had with Syria. I was happy to see the sanctions being removed on the Syrians as well as this Syrian civilians who suffers. But you also know what the purpose is. It's to which is less altruistic. But this is what I found a bit distasteful there, though, in Egypt. The way all the leaders had come to celebrate the greatness of Trump, and we see the same in Ukraine. Everyone is pandering to this delusion that the U.S. is a mediator, that Trump is this great peacemaker, mediator. I mean, the Ukraine war was started by the United States in 2014. It's been led ever since. Every efforts by the Ukrainian government to pursue find an off-ramp has been sabotaged by them, and yet the U.S. now gets to position itself as a mediator, seeking peace, and it's the same now in the Middle East. The Americans, this was not just Israel. The U.S. backed this genocide in Israel, not against Gaza, and now the whole world has to stand there, celebrate Trump for his great ability to bring peace. But I mean, it is again, I'm very happy that there's a pause in the killing, though I'm skeptical about how durable. But to celebrate this as a great peacemaker, I find it all quite strange. But
Yeah,
uh,
and in Ukraine, Trump was president, as far as I recall, for 4 years as this crisis evolved. It's not as if Trump was not a key part of this. He bragged about providing Ukraine with offensive capabilities and military capabilities to against the Russians. So he's definitely no peacemaker. And despite the fact that he claimed that he's going to end the war in one day, hundreds of thousands of people have died during his second presidency so far as a result of this war. And you're right. In what we saw in Cairo was a betrayal of the Palestinian people, a celebration of someone who in the Knesset was basically bragging about helping Netanyahu slaughter Palestinians. And the same is true in Egypt, in Syria. They removing the sanctions, but all those people who fell into the sectarian trap of the empire that was carried out by their proxies in the Persian Gulf and by Erdogan, and supported these extremist groups simply based on sectarianism. I'm basically on sectarianism. Not that the former Syrian government was some great government, but obviously ISIS and Al Qaeda are tools of the West. But they supported them because they were pushed into sectarianism by US proxies. But now the regime is still killing people. And the economic situation, Glenn, in Syria is worse. They have not removed the sanctions. The Americans had ample opportunity to do so. But they still, even though Petraeus can worry about Jolani's sleep at nights, and he can be one of his biggest fans, but the Caesar sanctions are very much in place. The situation today is worse, and those who are spending billions of dollars to help ISIS and Al Qaeda, they're not spending that money to invest in Syria today. Whether it's Erdogan, he's making money, sending in cheap Turkish goods, but no one is providing real assistance to Syria. The money that they were paying for the dirty war was much greater than any money that's going into Syria today. So this is the sad reality, but the world is changing. And the West is, as you rightly pointed out, it is not changing with the world. If the West was smart, they would recognize that the Israeli regime, its very existence is detrimental to their interests. Not only is ethno-supremacism attributed to the West, not only are these genocidal attacks on Lebanon, on Iran, the dirty war in Syria, the genocidal, the Holocaust in Gaza, are they attributed to the West by the international community? And people across the world look down at the West for all this. But also, if it wasn't for this, what would Iran's problem be with the West? We would have normal relations. The region, the public, which despises the West for what it's doing, they have no problem. They would have no problem. You'd have trade, you'd have business, you'd have investment. You wouldn't have millions of refugees in the West. Those right-wingers in the West who hate these Muslims or these dark-skinned people, if they thought carefully, they'd recognize that this is Western policy. These people didn't just go there. They were living comfortably in their own countries. But death, destruction, sanctions, dirty wars is what caused millions of people to move. Otherwise, everyone would like to be close to their parents, to their cousins, to their friends, to their neighbors, no one wants to move across the world and get separated from all those loved ones of theirs. But the fact is that all these crises that we see in Europe, Brexit was partially, regardless of whether it was a good thing or not, that's not the point. But Brexit happened partially because of Syria. When those millions, they showed those images of Syrians moving to Europe, and some people in Europe and in Britain voted for Brexit so that these people wouldn't enter the UK. And so if the Europeans had pursued a different line, a different course, instead of supporting genocide and ethno-supremacism, this region, West Asia and North Africa, would be their natural partner in business, in trade, and we wouldn't have this dystopian situation that we have today. And of course, the same is true with Latin America and the United States. The same is true with Asia and Africa and the West. This is just the problem that they have. They see themselves as exceptional, as having special privileges. They view the rest of the world, and increasingly their own people, as worthless, as inferior. And this is going to be their undoing.
It's always this continuous escalation. Escalation predictably results in war, especially against an adversary which doesn't seem like it can back down or subordinate itself. But I think the problem now is this obsession with peace through strength, which U.S. administration continues to repeat. But the point when you say strength is escalation. So what they keep saying is escalation is peace, and thus war does become peace. It's a very twisted way of of looking at the world instead of going back to the basics, which is trying to mitigate the competing security concerns.
Can I add one point that I think is really important? There is a pattern in the West. If you go back and look at American history, they did this with the Indians or the natives, where they would sign agreements and then they would undermine those agreements and take further territory and slaughter people and move westward. That's, that was it was a pattern. That's how they work today. They do an agreement with the Russians, the Minsk Accords, and then they undermine it. They do a deal with Iran, the nuclear deal, for example, then they undermine it. Or the deal between Iran and the IAEA in Cairo, they undermine it. They do trade deals with the Chinese. They carry out a trade war, then they do a deal, and then they undermine it. Right now, the issue of rare earths and minerals, it didn't start from Beijing. The United States, after the ceasefire in the trade war, they began to undermine it through different means. And this was the Chinese response. So they never abide by their commitments. And that is exactly what the Israeli regime does. The Israeli regime asks for a ceasefire in Lebanon, with Lebanon. The Western countries are the guarantors, but they violate it every day. Every day they murder people. They destroy infrastructure. They destroy homes. They destroy private factories. And the West does nothing about it. They can violate their commitments anytime they want. And the same is true in Gaza and elsewhere. And so what happens as a result? Gradually, the world says enough is enough. We do not want Western financial institutions because we can't trust them. We do not want to use the US dollar because we cannot trust them. We do not want them to be in our club, whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or in our club BRICS or whatever, because they're going to cause trouble. We want to have alternative routes for trade, such as the Belt and Road Initiative or the North-South corridor between Iran and Russia and elsewhere, because we don't want the West to be inside it. We want them to be out. Everyone wants them out because they're unreliable, they're untrustworthy, they're constantly violating their commitments. So in the short term, they benefit. They can sanction this factory, or they can destroy that city, or they can sanction this country, and they benefit. But in the long term, it causes the entire globe to distance itself from the West, and that basically makes the West, which has been isolating country after country individually and destroying country after country, it causes them when you look at the bigger picture and in the long term, it isolates the West, and they're sanctioning themselves, and they're weakening themselves. And people in the West, as the power of the establishment decreases, they begin to see the reality. They see through the narrative. And people in the West wake up to the reality of what the West is doing. Because it's no longer the axis of evil, Iran and North Korea and Iraq under Saddam Hussein, because that was the original axis of evil. So they can get away with their lies and their wars and their brutality. But when the axis of evil now becomes everyone, Russia, China, Iran, in some ways Brazil and India and the whole of West Asia and everyone who opposes them anywhere, and BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, then it's too much. It's too big, and it's not sustainable, and the West loses.
I think this is again the problem of the hegemonic ambitions, because if peace agreements are seen as, well, if they serve the purpose of coexistence or establishing a new status quo, then of course it can be trusted. But that assumes you want a status quo. If the goal is to defeat your adversaries, this is peace, then every peace agreement, every deal becomes a temporary ceasefire, an opportunity to regroup and prepare for the next battle. In this instance, yeah, international agreements, they can't impose any constraints. So I do fear we're moving into some, now that we're already way past the Imperial Overstretch here. But anyways,
and
any last
just one
words?
final point.
Yeah.
Just one final point, because you speak about Imperial Overstretch. As they decline, as this imperial power, as the empire declines, they become more crude, and it hurts them even more than before. They've cast aside the mask of human rights and freedom. they've even cast aside the you know um, the myth of the white man's burden or the civilizing mission. If they've gone back to just crude imperialism, you just bomb boats in the Caribbean, you just slaughter people. Uh, they're not even Venezuelan, but no one in the West, in the Western political establishment, protests about it. You just slaughter Gazans, you slaughter Lebanese. All that is done by the empire now openly. But ironically, the reaction today is far worse for the West than it would have been 2 decades ago. Because now people see this as just a crude and dying empire on the one hand, but also the myth of Western civilization. I mean, I'm not talking about ordinary people. I'm talking about the elites. The free world and the civilized world versus the rest of the world. All that has collapsed, and that soft power of the West, alongside its declining economic and military power, it is all being swept away. So the empire, instead of being smart in preserving parts of its empire, its behavior is becoming increasingly crude, and it is pushing for the collapse of that empire at a speed which I think is unprecedented in human history, partially because of the existence of the new technologies and so on. But this is the fastest declining empire that's ever existed in human history.
It goes slow until it suddenly goes very, very
Goes off
fast.
the cliff.
Yeah. Anyways, thank you so much for taking time. I know you have a busy day there ahead of you. So thanks again.
Thank you very much for having me, Glenn.